The galactic sovereignty didn't destroy humanity. They did something worse. They watched. They watched as the colonies fell one by one: Kepler Station, the Mars Confederacy, the 12 rings of the Outer Reach, each one extinguished like a candle pinched between cold, indifferent fingers. They watched as humanity's fleet burned to wreckage in the dark between stars. They watched as the last human warship broadcasted a final distress signal into empty, uncaring space. And then the sovereignty did what they considered the most merciful thing imaginable. They left humanity alive, quarantined, caged behind a blockade of 3,000 warships, sealed inside their own solar system like animals locked inside a dying terrarium. Earth, one moon, a handful of broken orbital stations. The sovereignty's High Chancellor broadcast the terms of surrender across every frequency in the galaxy, his voice smooth as carved marble, his contempt barely hidden beneath diplomatic language. Humanity has been contained. The experiment is over. The galaxy cheered. Even humanity's oldest trading partners said nothing. Even the species humanity had died to protect said nothing. That silence, that terrible galaxy-wide silence, was the biggest mistake any civilization had made in 400,000 years of recorded history. Because they forgot one thing. Humans don't need allies to start a war. They just need time. The blockade had been held for 11 years. 11 years of rationing. 11 years of engineered scarcity. The sovereignty subtly controlling what raw materials managed to slip past the cordon, just enough to keep humanity breathing, never enough to let it stand. It was a masterwork of slow strangulation, cruel in its patience, elegant in its precision. The sovereignty's lead admiral, a 7-foot creature of pale, chitinous grace named Verk-San, had designed the quarantine himself. He monitored it personally from his flagship Absolute Mercy, a vessel so massive it created its own gravitational shadow. He reviewed the weekly sensor reports with something approaching boredom. Human energy signatures were declining. Human construction was minimal. Human military activity was, according to his analysts, essentially non-existent. They were watching a species die slowly. It was, Verk-San believed, almost sad. He had visited Earth once, early in his career, before the war. He remembered the strange, chaotic beauty of the place, the messy seas, the violent weather systems, the sprawling cities that seemed to grow without plan or permission. He remembered watching humans in a marketplace, arguing and laughing and grieving all within the same hour, wearing their emotions on the outside of their skin like open wounds. He had found them fascinating in the way one finds a storm fascinating, beautiful from a distance, devastating up close, but the storm had been caged. The lightning had been grounded, or so he believed. The sensor report that crossed his desk on the 4,032nd day of the blockade was flagged as a low-priority anomaly. An ensign had almost deleted it. The report noted something strange in the readings from Earth's northern hemisphere, specifically beneath the Ural mountain range, geothermal readings that didn't match natural volcanic patterns, energy signatures that appeared briefly before vanishing entirely as if something was learning how to hide. Verk-San read the report twice. He set it aside. He picked it up again. He stared at it for a long time with the 4 pale eyes that his species used for deep focus, the ones that could detect light in spectrums humans couldn't see, the ones his people trusted above all others. He told himself it was nothing, but his 4 pale eyes didn't blink for a very long time. Her name was Dr. Yale Oduya, and she hadn't seen sunlight in 6 years. She didn't miss it, not anymore. You stop missing things that feel like a different life. And her life, the real one, the only one that mattered now, existed 3 kilometers beneath the Ural Mountains, in the largest engineering project in human history. A project that no satellite could see. A project that no sovereignty sensor array could fully interpret. A project that humanity's greatest minds, the physicists, The engineers, the quantum theorists, the people who had once built wonders for peacetime and had quietly, grimly, turned those same gifts toward something else, had been building since the second year of the blockade. Yale called it the Gate. The official designation was longer, more technical, buried in language designed to mean nothing if intercepted. But the people who worked here, who had given years and health and daylight to its construction, called it the Gate, because that's what it was, a door. And the question everyone stopped asking aloud, because asking it made the fear too real, was, a door to what? The physics were, on paper, impossible. That was the point. Conventional faster-than-light travel required established relay points, beacon networks, the sovereignty's carefully maintained transit infrastructure. Infrastructure the sovereignty had cut off when the blockade began. Humanity couldn't go anywhere. Every route was watched, every corridor was sealed. So Yale and her team had asked a different question. Not how do we use the roads they control, but what if we built roads they've never imagined? Fold space engineering, recursive dimensional threading. The exploitation of a property in spacetime that the sovereignty's physics, elegant, ancient, and utterly convinced of its own completeness, had never bothered to investigate because their models said it was impossible. Human models said it was improbable. There is an enormous difference between impossible and improbable. Humans had always lived in that difference. The gate was 2 kilometers wide. It hummed with energies that made the air taste like lightning and copper. It looked in the dim construction lighting like someone had taken the concept of a horizon and bent it into a circle, the way you might bend a piece of wire. On the day of the first successful test, Yale had sent a probe through. It came back 6 seconds later, from the other side of the galaxy. She had cried, and she hadn't cried in 3 years. Not because she was cold, but because she had stopped letting herself feel anything she couldn't afford to feel. She cried now, silently in the dark, with the hum of the gate filling her chest like a second heartbeat. Then she wiped her eyes and went back to work, because the first gate was only the prototype. They had built 72 more. The message arrived on a Tuesday, or what humanity still called Tuesday, though the concept of days had become somewhat religious in the blockade years, a way of maintaining the fiction of normalcy, of time still meaning something. The message came from outside the blockade. It was encrypted in a dead language, not a sovereignty language, but one that human archaeologists had spent decades reconstructing from ruins on a moon in the Antares system. A language belonging to a species that the sovereignty claimed had simply evolved beyond physical existence 10,000 years ago. The sovereignty's official history said they had ascended. The message told a different story. They were erased. We saw what you are building. We have been waiting. You are not the first species the sovereignty has caged, but you may be the last they ever cage. Below these coordinates, what they buried, what they feared you'd find. We cannot fight them, but we can give you what they took from themselves when they forgot what it cost to be mortal. The coordinates pointed to a location inside the blockade's own sensor shadow, a dead spot in the monitoring grid, tiny, nearly undetectable, used by sovereignty surveillance ships as a navigational anchor point. Hiding something in plain sight, in the ruins of the very first station humanity had ever built beyond the moon, abandoned, supposedly empty. Yale read the message 4 times and then sat perfectly still for 11 minutes while her mind did what human minds do best when given a mystery and a deadline. It ran. The recovery team found it inside the ruins of Gateway Station 1. It looked like nothing. A data core, ancient by human standards, ancient by any standards, but human hands had been the last to touch it, which meant it had been placed there before the blockade, before the war, before any of this. Someone had known, someone had prepared. The data core contained a weapon, not in the physical sense, no schematics, no designs for some galaxy-ending device. It was more dangerous than that. It contained truth. 460,000 years of unbroken recorded history, harvested from dozens of civilizations across the galaxy. Civilizations the sovereignty said had ascended, evolved, or simply faded. Species that the history books described in the past tense with gentle, diplomatic vagueness. The truth was that every single one of them had done what humanity was doing, had grown powerful, had grown defiant, had begun to discover technologies the sovereignty hadn't discovered first. And every single one of them had been quarantined, and every single one of them had been left in their quarantine until they were gone. This was not a war. It had never been a war. It was pest control. And the sovereignty had been doing it with quiet, terrible efficiency since before humanity had learned to write. Yale read the files for 14 hours straight. When she finally looked up, her face was the face of someone who had walked into a room expecting to find a monster and found something so much worse. The proof that the monster had always been there, that it had always been winning, and that every species that had ever looked at the stars and dared to reach for them had been silently, patiently removed. She stood up. She walked to the main communications terminal. She broadcast on a tight beam encrypted channel, a single word to the network of 73 gates humming patiently beneath the skin of the earth. Open. Admiral Verksan was reviewing his morning reports when his ship screamed, not metaphorically. The alert systems of absolute mercy, systems designed to respond to threats that had never existed before, systems tuned to frequencies of danger that had never been encountered in 4,000 years of sovereignty dominance, activated simultaneously, producing a sound that his species associated with one concept and one concept only. The impossible is happening. He was on the bridge in 40 seconds. The visual feed stopped him cold. Earth looked the same. Blue and white and quietly beautiful, wrapped in its atmosphere like something precious. The blockade was intact, 3,000 ships in perfect formation. But beneath the ships beneath them in the space between the blockade and the planet, space itself was tearing. Not breaking, not exploding, tearing, like fabric. Like the universe was a curtain and something behind it had grabbed the edge and was pulling. 73 points of light ignited simultaneously across Earth's northern hemisphere. 73 pillars of structured energy punched upward through the atmosphere, through the blockade formation, and opened. Verksan had studied space-time physics for 60 years. He had no category for what he was seeing. The gates didn't look like portals. They looked like wounds. Vast, perfect, geometrically precise wounds in the skin of reality, each one 2 kilometers wide, each one humming with a frequency his instruments kept trying to measure and kept failing to name. What are those? He whispered. Nobody answered him, because nobody on his bridge had words for what came through them next. They came through in silence. The first ship was unrecognizable, not because it was alien, but because it was human, and humans had spent 11 years in the places the sovereignty had buried its secrets, scavenging, learning, adapting. The ship was built from the bones of older, stranger technologies, grafted onto human engineering with the desperate creative ferocity of a species that had decided it had nothing left to lose. The second ship followed, then the third, then hundreds, then thousands. They poured through the gates like water through a broken dam, not just human ships but ships crewed by survivors of species the sovereignty's history said were gone, species that had gone underground, had scattered, had waited in the dark places between stars for someone to finally open a door. The species the sovereignty had called extinct were furious. Verksan stared at his tactical display as it tried and failed to count the contacts emerging from the gates. The number kept climbing. 3,000, 8,000, 15,000. The system couldn't keep up. It started displaying an error message he had never seen before. Contact count exceeds threat classification parameters. His communications officer turned from her console with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Fear. Admiral, she said, the humans are hailing us. On screen. The face that appeared was a woman's face, Dark eyes, hollow cheeks. The face of someone who had lived underground for 6 years and carried every one of those years like weight behind her eyes. She was not a soldier. She was not a politician. She was something the sovereignty had never had to negotiate with before. She was a scientist who was angry. "This is Dr. Yale Oduya," she said, "speaking for what remains of humanity and for every species your sovereignty decided it had the right to erase." Her voice was steady, almost gentle, the gentleness of someone who has moved beyond rage into something colder and more absolute. "We found your records, all of them. We know what you are. We know what you've done. And we've spent 11 years sharing that knowledge with every surviving member of every civilization you thought you'd successfully eliminated." She paused. "We gave them all coordinates. Verxon's blood, a pale blue fluid his species kept very close to their skin, ran very cold." "Coordinates to what?" he asked, though some part of him, the part that had stared at that anomaly report and not blinked, already knew. Yale tilted her head slightly. "To your home system," she said. "To your shipyards. To your political centers. To every location you kept off the official charts because you were afraid someone someday would do exactly what we're about to do." She leaned forward slightly. 73 gates, Admiral. We built 73. We kept 3 for ourselves." A pause. "We gave the other 70 to the people you tried to kill." The tactical display erupted. Across the sovereignty's territory, across the 1,000 systems they had held for 400 millennia, gates were opening. Not here. Everywhere, species that had hidden for centuries, species that had starved in exile, species that had watched their homeworlds fall silent and their histories be rewritten and their names erased from a galaxy that had simply been told they were gone. They were not gone. They were home. The battle lasted 9 days. Not because the sovereignty fought well, they fought brilliantly, with 4,000 years of tactical doctrine, with technologies that had dominated a galaxy. They fought with everything they had. It wasn't enough. Because the ships coming through the gates weren't fighting like a fleet. They were fighting like something with a grudge. There is a particular quality to the warfare of species who have been told they don't exist anymore, who have watched their children grow up in hiding, whispering memories of skies they've never seen, who have carried the weight of extinction that wasn't for so long that the anger has become structural, has become load-bearing, the thing that holds them upright. They do not retreat. They do not negotiate. They do not accept terms. The human fleet stayed in the middle, and this was the moment that every battle analyst who studied the recordings afterward would mark as the turning point of the war that ended the war. Because the human fleet didn't push forward. The human fleet held the center. They absorbed the sovereignty's most devastating counter-strikes. They took damage that should have broken them and kept broadcasting on all frequencies, a continuous signal, a constant message. We are still here. We are still here. We are still here. Verxon, watching his empire fold from the bridge of a ship that was slowly losing power, understood it at last. This was the thing his models had never been able to quantify about humanity. The variable his analysts had always rounded down to 0 because it defied rational strategic assessment. Humans didn't fight to win. Humans fought to mean something. Every other species in the galaxy, including his own, fought because they calculated that victory was achievable. When victory became impossible, they adapted. They retreated. They recalculated. Humans fought hardest when winning seemed least likely, because for them the act of fighting was the victory. The refusal to stop was the statement. The persistence was the weapon. And they had handed that weapon, that beautiful, irrational, terrifying weapon, to every species they'd found hiding in the dark. They had taught the extinct how to be relentless. The sovereignty surrendered on the 31st day. Not in battle, the fleet was broken long before that. The surrender came from the political core, from the High Council, transmitted on emergency frequencies to every active gate, to every ship, to every planet still watching with held breath. The galaxy had never seen a sovereignty surrender. It didn't have a word for it. The peace negotiations lasted 3 years. They were complicated, painful, and frequently on the verge of collapse, because peace between those who had erased and those who had been erased is not a document you sign. It is a wound you decide, every day, to treat instead of reopen. Yale Oduya led the human delegation. She was not a diplomat. She had no training in galactic law. What she had was the data core, every record of every civilization the sovereignty had quietly extinguished, and the absolute refusal to let a single name be forgotten. She read every name into the official record. It took 4 days. The sovereignty representatives sat in silence for all 4 days, and whatever they felt, whether it was shame or fear or something their species had never had cause to feel before, it kept them in their seats. On the day the treaty was signed, the gates opened one final time, not for warships but for the generation ships, the colony vessels, the archive carriers filled with seeds and soil samples and preserved genetic material, and the trillion small objects that constitute the soul of a civilization. The lost species were going home. The gates, humanity quietly announced, would remain open, free, for everyone, no toll, no restriction. No authority controlling who could travel to which star, just doors, open to anyone willing to walk through. On the last day of the negotiations, one of the Sovereignty Council members, young by their standards, barely 2 centuries old, approached Yale as she packed her materials. He had spent the entire negotiation watching the humans with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between awe and genuine confusion. He spoke carefully, in the measured tones of someone choosing words, like someone choosing where to step on uncertain ground. "I need to understand something," he said. "When the blockade began, when you had lost everything, your fleet, your colonies, your allies, when we had reduced you to a single planet and 3,000 ships watched every direction you could possibly go," he paused. "Why didn't you surrender?" Yale looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 6 years underground. She thought about a probe coming back from the other side of the galaxy in 6 seconds. She thought about all the names she had read for 4 days, all the civilizations that had faced this same moment and made a different choice or had the choice taken from them. She picked up her bag. "Because surrendering," she said, "would have meant agreeing that you had the right to decide we were finished." She walked toward the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back over her shoulder, and there was something in her expression that the young counselor would describe later to anyone who would listen. Something he had no word for in his language, something that he decided, after long consideration, must be the look of a species that had stared into the dark and decided the dark blinked first. "We're never finished," she said, and she walked out into the light. Across the galaxy, in chambers and councils and command centers and small, quiet rooms where frightened people tried to understand what they had witnessed, the same realization was spreading like a tide, slow and vast and inevitable. The humans had not survived the blockade. The blockade had not survived the humans. And every civilization that had ever looked at that small, blue, unremarkable world and seen something lesser, something containable, something finite, finally, truly understood. You don't cage a species that builds doors. You don't bury a people who taught themselves to dig. And you do not, you must never, for as long as stars burn and the dark between them remains, you do not make humanity feel like they have nothing left to lose. Because that is not when humans stop. That is when humans start.